Our fourth speaker is Jason Moore, founder of Midnight Oil. He specializes in equipping the church for creative worship, pivoting overnight from teaching seminars to webinars once the pandemic hit. He provided advice not found anywhere that I could see from the beginning on topics about online worship design and media production that's hospitable and achievable, even for the smallest of churches. He previously worked as a graphic and animation artist at Ginghamsburg United Methodist Church in Ohio, which is one of the largest United Methodist churches in the U.S. He is an author of multiple journal articles, several books. He also received Telly Awards for excellence in video production, and he is presently focusing on a new book and will be providing coaching and consultations for 200 churches and one of the conferences in the United Methodist Church, and also webinars just across the denomination and with several other conferences. Last spring, as I was providing worship webinars and coaching online, a mutual friend insisted that I sign up for one of Jason's webinars. And I was so impressed with his work and ideas. I knew that he would be just a perfect addition to our day-to-day. Over the past 12 months, he's been increasingly refining and expanding his presentations to include what happens when this pandemic is over. So without further delay, Jason, welcome. I'm so glad that you could join us today.
Thank you, Suzanne. I'm so excited to be a part of this day. I'm sure your brains are all very full. What a wonderful thing it is to be a part of this great group of speakers. I was so excited to hear Dr. Wiseman and Dr. Crawford and Dr. Tell. And I'm sure that your brains are full, but I hope you have a little room left as we talk about what I like to call both and worship. Well, that is my fancy schmancy intro. So any guesses on what my inspiration for that might be? Any guesses? I'm going to ask you in the chat. So we're going to use the chat a lot today. So if you could just put in the chat any guesses on what my inspiration for that clip might be, you'd be the first group not to get it. All right, I'm going to just tell you, Stranger Things. Tron is close, Corey. Very good. So let me just share a couple things here, housekeeping wise, before we jump in. Number one, you're really going to have to get your fingers on the keyboard for this particular presentation because we are going to chat a lot today, more so than you have up until now. Second thing is make sure that your chat is changed from two panelists to panelists and attendees so everybody can see it. And then finally, as questions arise, I hope the chat moves fast today. And if you have a question you'd like to ask, we're going to pick up on those in the end. 1970s disco, that's good. So if we haven't met, my name is Jason Moore, and my ministry is called Midnight Oil Productions. I got my start, as Suzanne told you, at a large Methodist church in Ohio. My passion is creating deep, meaningful, creative worship, and worship that drives people deep in their personal faith development, but also toward mission in the world. And of course, all of that changed about a year ago when the world shut down as a pandemic kind of overtook our world. And so we're going to talk about how to create worship that is both for people gathered in person and online and how we face that. I'm also putting in the chat a handbook for this session. Now, I've got to tell you, I am doing a 2.5-hour workshop on this topic, and I've got an hour to talk to you. So I'm going to have to skip a lot. I can't get into everything. So if you have that handbook that you download, there will be things that I don't have time to get to. So let's just talk real quick about what's happened in the last year in worship. Prior to March or so, when many of us jumped online, there were churches that were already doing streaming worship. And the reality of that streaming worship was that we more or less talked to the room and we'd say, welcome to worship. We're so glad you're here today. Thanks for coming. And then if we were streaming, we'd at some point turn to the camera and say, and hey, if you're worshiping with us online today, thanks for coming. We're glad you're here. And then we'd more or less go back for the rest of the hour or whatever and talk to the room. Now, back then, it was the only model we had. And so we didn't really give it a whole lot of thought. I liked being able to worship from vacation or from home or wherever I might be. But when the pandemic hit, if you were streaming online prior to the pandemic, you went from here to here and people at home could feel that change. Now, I would guess that most of us on this in this webinar today began our online worship about a year ago in March. And so, friends, you spent an entire year talking to the camera, designing worship for people in their homes. And I think that we face one of the most critical moments in the life of the church as we begin to go back to in-person worship. If we're not careful, one of two things may happen. Number one is we've been talking to the camera for a year. So if we get people back in the room, we could very easily turn them into the studio audience, like Saturday Night Live or something like that, where it feels like they're just there to provide the claps and the laughs and the background music and so on for the people watching at home. That's one option. The other option is, I think the more likely option is that we'll get people back in the room and then we'll revert to what we used to do, and we'll just talk to those people in the room, and we'll forget that the camera represents a large percentage of people who are not with us. Now, I'm not going to do this today. I'm not going to talk to my room because that would be pretty distracting over the next hour. But friends, what I hope that we'll consider is how do we create worship where no one feels like an afterthought, where the people that are gathered in our physical space and the people that are gathered at home will connect with us. So I want to build a bit of a base for us to work from as we understand worship in this time. Then we're going to talk about 3 strategies for what I call both and worship. First, I think it's important that we reimagine worship for the time that we are living in. I have nothing but admiration and kudos, and I'm celebrating all that you have done in the last year. It is as if we are witnessing the modern day equivalent of Gutenberg firing up the press for the very first time and making the Bible available to everyone. You heard a reference to that earlier today. Friends, we are sharing Jesus with people who wouldn't necessarily come in our physical doors. Let me just ask in the chat, how many of you have noticed that you've seen more viewers or more people participating in your worship online than you've had in your physical building in a while? This is your chance to use the chat. Let me know that you're there. I can't see you. Don't leave me hanging. Somebody put, there we go. Nancy, you broke the ice. Okay, good. Okay, I'm seeing lots of yeses now. Lots of yeses. Many of you are seeing that. Very good. So friends, one of the things I think we have to be aware of is that we in the last year started taking church to people rather than expecting people to come to church. It used to be that people had to come to us at a certain time in a certain place, and they came on our turf, on our terms. And what we did a year ago was we took our message to them, and it's different. You can't assume all the same things. Look at the impact you're having. Look at the impact you're having in that chat. I see a number of you saying that your attendance, you're reaching more people than ever before. So one of the ways that I have been framing the conversation that I've been having for the last year is to think about what happens when you translate a story from book to film. Let me ask another question in the chat. How many of you have ever read a book that they made a film out of it and you didn't really like the film as well as you liked the book? How many of you have had that experience? You read the book, they made the film, you didn't really like the film quite as much. Yes, right, all the time, absolutely, yes. So that's where many of us are, right? The reality is that the book is almost always better than the film. And friends, I'd like to suggest that that's kind of what our mentality is about online worship. We love in-person worship and we're tolerating online worship. But friends, here's what I want you to consider. 2 things. Number one, there are people who will never walk into the bookstore. There are people who will never check out a book from the library, so they'll never experience the story. But when a story becomes a film, when a book becomes a film, that story is opened up to a whole new audience. And more people go to see films than buy books. And so, friends, we are exposing people to the transformational power of Jesus Christ by telling our old story in a new way. And I think that's pretty incredible. The second thing I want you to consider is that the book, the in-person experience, we have spent centuries, decades, very long time developing our practices. and our methodologies and our theology about worship in person. And so we're comparing something that is very mature to something that is completely immature. We've only had a year, most of us, to really even think about how do you do worship online. One of the solutions for many of us when we first entered this pandemic was to just put a camera in the back of the room and kind of do worship as we always had. We didn't really do anything in the way of translation. And so this is going to sting a little, but I've got to say it because I want to be honest with you. Simply putting a camera in the room does not mean you're doing hybrid worship. Simply putting a camera in the room does not mean you're doing hybrid worship. It may mean you're streaming worship, but it doesn't mean that you're doing hybrid worship. Hybrid worship means that you are creating a new form of worship that speaks to the people in the room and the people at home equally. You know, the NFL would never put a camera up in the nosebleed seats and broadcast that as the game. They have multiple cameras, they have commentators, you know, all those kind of things. Now, I don't believe you have to have anything more than a phone to do really effective worship. I think you can do even more with multiple cameras and software and things like that. But friends, what I want you to hear today is what you do in front of the camera is more important than the camera itself. So I know I'm going to talk a little fast here because I got a lot of stuff I want to cover. So first thing I want you to consider when you translate a story from one medium to the next, from book to film, is that you have to consolidate the story. You can't tell that story in the same way as you might otherwise. Many books, you know, take hours and hours and hours to read, and the film is often 2 hours long. And so the online worship that we offer may need to look a little different than the worship that we do in person. Let me ask in the chat, how long prior to the pandemic, how long was your worship? Just put it in the chat. How long did you go in your in-person worship experience before? Okay, I'm seeing a couple hours there, hour. Okay, that's pretty typical. Some of you have got a really healthy service, 2 hours, very good. So what I have been learning in doing about 70 or 75 webinars since last March on this topic, most people seem to be going about an hour in person. Well, we've been given a little bit of advice from Facebook and those in ministry about where our online worship should be. Some of you may have heard of Nona Jones. Nona is a pastor in Florida, but also works for Facebook. She is the director of faith-based partnerships. And Nona has a book out, which is escaping me at the moment, the title of it, but it's all about online worship. Someone can Google that and put it in the chat. Nona Jones, book on worship. You'll find it. But Nona had this to say in another training that I did where I was teaching alongside her. Nona said this, when it comes to online worship, keep it tight, keep it interesting, keep it engaging, and don't go longer than 25 to 35 minutes. She went on to say that if you go longer than 40 minutes, according to everything they've learned at Facebook, people will tune out. Now, you might look at your screen right now and say, Jason, that just doesn't match my experience. My people will hang for the entire thing. Well, the key word there, friends, is my people. I want you to consider that now you are reaching people who are not just your people. You're reaching new people. Someone earlier in the chat, I saw it go by, say we're reaching new, different people, which is incredible. So if we want to create worship that people engage in a deeper way, I want you to consider that's a very different experience in the sacred space when you're around the stained glass windows and the woodwork and those pews or whatever, or if you're in a non-traditional setting, the smoke machines and the lights and whatever style of worship you do, there's something about being in that space with other people that feels very different than watching from your couch. So the first thing we have to consider is that we have to consolidate worship in this time. Second thing is that we have to make some adaptations to the music or to the worship that we do. And one of those adaptations is in the way that we participate in the singing aspects of worship. Now, you just saw an incredible workshop about how to engage people in deeper ways through Zoom and other things. But what I'm finding for the worship that we're streaming or broadcasting, not in a Zoom setting, is that people aren't participating in the same way. So let me ask in the chat, how many of you are fully engaged in the singing portion of worship from your home? You're singing all the verses, you're clapping, you're engaged in the same way that you might be in the room. So I'm seeing no, some yeses, some nos. I'm all in, no, yes. Okay, you're an interesting bunch. I'm getting some of you. What I have been hearing in all of my webinars is that about, I'd say 85 or 90% of folks are telling me that they're not singing in their in-person worship at home in the same way that they do in person. Now, I wish I had time to get into the nuances of this. I don't have 2.5 hours, which is what I typically have for this, only an hour. So we can't get deep in. But one of the things I think we have to consider is that worship online looks different than in person. And so you may have to reduce your songs a bit. The church that I attend in their online worship, we're doing 2 songs in the online experience and about 6 or 7 songs in the in-person experience because things don't translate quite the same. So music, one more just quick adaptation. Our practice in in-person worship is often to put the lyrics up on the screen for those of us who have screens in our worship space. And if we sing a song and we sing multiple verses and then we sing another song and multiple verses, it's not long before you start to lose sight of the human element and you can't see me anymore and you start to feel a sense of disconnect. One of the things I really appreciated about Dr. Tell's presentation was that he was making eye contact with the camera and giving you instruction and inviting you into the experience. We don't want people to just watch us worship. We want them to participate. So if you take what used to be on your screen and just put it on your feed for Facebook or YouTube or whatever, the human element becomes sort of secondary, and I think people disengage. So one option is through software to do something more like this, where you put the lyrics on the screen along with the person that is presenting, or you could put the lyrics on a screen that is visible on camera. So if you don't have a fancy setup, you could put it on a TV or whatever. The second thing I want you to consider is that we have to adapt our liturgical practices, our sacraments, all of those things that we might typically do in person feel a little different. It's a very different experience in the room to take communion in a socially distanced environment where we have masks on and we're 6 feet apart and we go up to receive one of these little hermetically sealed communion thingamabops. That's a very different experience in the building than it is at home watching people go stand in line to take communion, like Dr. Crawford said, sitting in their pajamas or whatever. It's a very different experience. So not everything we do in the room translates to at home. If we have time, I'll unpack that a little bit. But I do believe there's a way to do both and when it comes to the sacraments. Let me show you one example of what this looks like. This is a more liturgical church that's doing a spoken word call to worship as part of their worship experience. Listen to what the pastor says to lead into this and what he invites people to do, and then watch what's happening on the screen.
Please join me for our call to worship, which can be found in your online order of worship. Gather this day in silence and hope. We wait for God's word for us. Let your hearts and spirits be open. God is our strength and salvation. We wait patiently for the Lord. With willing hearts and spirits, we wait for the Lord.
So what you heard there, you may have heard, is that he invited people to the online worship order, to the digital worship order. So friends, one of the things you may consider is posting in your chat or in the description to your online worship a PDF file of what would typically be the bulletin so that people can participate. One of the things I hope that you'll take from this day and specifically from this time we're spending together is that we've got to get away from the language of the idea that people are watching worship online. We don't want watchers, we want worshipers. We don't want viewers, we want participants. People can't participate if we don't give them a way to participate. It's one of the things I really appreciated about Dr. Tell's presentation is that he's inviting you to engage and participate. So get away from the language of watching and viewing, but make sure that we give people an opportunity to really be a part of it. Another aspect of worship that was mentioned earlier that, again, I'm just so passionate about is to consider that giving is an act of worship, and we can't skip that part. So I want to encourage you to do 2 things when it comes to giving. Number one, teach people how to give. In this season that we're in, we don't get to pass the plate for those of us who are not yet gathered in person. And we leave out a whole lot of people if the only option is to give via the mail. Let me ask in the chat, how many of you are doing some kind of online? Thank you, Patricia, for posting Nona's book there. Appreciate that. Let me ask you, how many of you are doing online giving, and what service are you using for your online giving? Venko, Nicole is using Venko. I see another Venko there. PushPay. It's going fast, but you're seeing it. So friends, I have heard for years people say, we don't want to do online giving because we have to pay fees. We have to pay 3% of our offering goes to the processing company. Let me suggest to you that 100% of the people who can't give right now, you lose all 100% of those gifts. So it's better to give up 3% than 100% of the people who can't give. And then if we consider that we want young people to engage in the life of the church fully and in stewardship, we can't ask a millennial to write a check. There are not a lot of millennials that carry checkbooks these days. So I think it's important to think about holistically about our churches. And so they're more likely to Venmo you or Cash App you or PayPal you offering and participate in that way. So two things. Number one, teach them how to give. If you've never done a tutorial, show them how. Dr. Crawford talked about, she has something that comes up at the bottom of her screen throughout. You might say, if you have this available, go to your phone and download in the App Store the Church Center app, and then search for the name of our church, and you can go to the giving tab and give that way, or you could put your offering in the mail, or you can go to our website and click on the giving link. Teach people how to give. But friends, I would like to suggest to you that the why is more important than the how. How matters, but we also have to teach people how or why to give in this time. And this is my old colleague, my pastor at Ginghamsburg Church when I was on staff there, a good friend of mine, Mike Slaughter, puts it this way. He says, money follows mission, not church budgets. Money follows mission, not church budgets. So friends, it is so important that we tell people why nobody gets excited about paying your light bill. But people do get excited about seeing lives transformed. Now, if we had more time today, I would show you a video of what the why looks like, but we don't have time for that given how much time we have to talk about this. But let me just suggest to you that you tell the story of where your offering is going. Show people where those gifts are going. And so in my day-long seminar, I show a video about a mobile grocery store that a church is supporting, and hearing the stories of the people that get to engage in that and volunteer and get groceries from it and so on. If you'll share with people where their dollars and cents are going, you'll have givers that are much more excited. Now, this next one could be a sacred cow in your church. I don't know if it is or not, but give people up front instead of doing announcements. I think the announcements don't work great in in-person worship anyway, because they kind of kill the flow of worship, but they really don't work so well online. So I want to suggest to you that you not do announcements as part of your worship up front, but instead give people an ROI. An ROI stands for return on investment. Tell people what they're going to get for the time they invest with you. So in my tribe, in the United Methodist Church, that's kind of where I come from, there's a common practice where we might do a prelude, an opening piece of music, and then following that opening piece of music, someone might say, good morning, welcome to worship. We're so glad you're here today. Let me tell you about some of the things that are happening in the life of our church. And so they might say something like, on Monday night, and this will make sense if any of you are Methodist, our UMW is meeting on Monday night. Now, I always tell people, don't say your UMW is meeting, because people are going to wonder, what are the United Mine Workers doing at your church? Now, if you're United Methodist, you probably know that stands for United Methodist Women's Group. But we've got to give our announcements when we do give them in a way that the outsider can understand. So we might say that. We might say our United Methodist Women's Group is meeting on Monday. And then next week, we're going to have a bake sale to send kids to camp. And are you bored yet? Because I'm bored. I want to turn it off. Friends, if you start your online worship in such a way that you're giving people a bunch of information up front and they're not yet connected to you, it's really easy to turn it off. So an ROI looks more like this. Good morning, friends. Welcome to worship. We are so glad that you have chosen to spend the next 35 minutes with us. We're in the midst of a series that we call Finding Your Faith in the Midst of Fear. And in week 1, we talked about what fear is. In week 2, we talked about facing our fear. And today, we are going to talk about praying through our fear. So you're going to hear a message, you're going to hear some music, we are going to read scripture, and you're going to hear some ways that you can put this into practice this week. So friends, as you are able, let's worship together the God who is with us in all that we face. Well, what I've done in that moment is I've enticed you into the experience. I've told you that we're going to sing, we're going to hear scripture, you're going to hear a message, you know where we've been the last few weeks, and then what I would suggest to you is that you stop doing announcements and start doing action steps. So after the sermon is over, this doesn't have to be the pastor, it could be someone else. When the sermon is over, you say, friends, we've been talking about finding our faith in the midst of fear. And I want to give you 3 ways this week to do that. The first one is that our United Methodist Women's Ministry is meeting for Bible study on Monday night. I can't think of a better way to find our faith than to do so with like-minded people, and we can face our fears together. The second is that we've got some young people that are going to go to summer camp this summer, and it's one of the best ways to discover faith as a young person. And when you're a young person, there are lots of different ways that we face fear, from student pressure, peer pressure, school, COVID, all of these things. And so we're going to have a bake sale to send those kids to camp next week. And I hope that you'll participate in that. And I'm not going to go on, but do you see how those now become action steps? They're not 4 random pieces of information that I would want to click off. If I've invested the time to sit through your sermon and your music and your liturgy and everything else, you're now telling me how to put into practice what we're talking about. So that's one adaptation that I think you might consider making. I also think that it's important that we acknowledge the grief, that when we consolidate and we adapt, we may be cutting something that is someone's favorite thing. We should acknowledge the pain of that. And the people who don't like what you're doing tend to be the ones that are louder than the ones that do. But as one of the other speakers said earlier, we are living in a time right now where the church is open to all sorts of new things. I have never in my 25 years of ministry seen the church be so malleable. So I keep telling pastors, do not waste this opportunity to try and do new things. Let's continue on. The next thing that I want you to consider is that as we move through this time that we're living in, we have to continue to iterate and innovate. For me, this was the most exciting thing about 2020, was watching churches try new things, innovate and iterate. You all got online in a week or two. And again, I've got nothing but admiration for you and all that you've done in this season. Give yourselves a pat on the back for the way that you have met this time we're living in. Now, one of the things I saw was churches were trying new things every week. And while it was exciting and sometimes a little scary and exhilarating and everything in between, one of the things I saw happen was around Mother's Day, there was a little bit of a shift that happened. I heard a number of churches that I coach and consult and just kind of keep my eyes on tell me that around Mother's Day, their attendance dropped and they never fully recovered, and they couldn't quite figure out why that was. Now, I think part of it was that was Mother's Day and we maybe hung with mom that day. But I also think that Mother's Day represented the time where we had had enough online worship under our belt that maybe we learned 2 or 3 tricks. And we just kept doing those tricks over and over. So first it was lots of experimentation. Let's try this, let's try this. And then it was like, hey, that worked and that worked and that worked. Let's just do that every single week. And after a while, what we had, what was a new exciting thing became kind of a templated thing. I'm from Dayton, Ohio, and the founder of Imes Pet Food is from here in Dayton. And he has a business center here that I work in sometimes. And I love this quote that's on one of the walls. He had this to say, and I think it speaks to where we're living right now. Clay Mathiel says, the only difference between a rut and a groove is how long you've been in it. The only difference between a rut and a groove is how long you've been in it. Friends, I would like to suggest to you that back in March of last year, we found a new groove. And it was incredible. It was exciting. You're reaching more people now than you've ever reached before. But after a while, if we don't change things up, that rut or that groove becomes a rut, and we lose a little bit of the sense of intrigue and excitement and mystery that is part of the worship. And people don't keep coming back if it is just the same thing over and over. How many of you dislike spoiler alerts? I'm sure that's all of us, right? How many of you in the room are fans of the Disney Plus show, The Mandalorian? Do I have any Mandalorian fans in the room? Yes? No? Yes? All right. I got a couple there. Now, here are my Mandalorian fans. Okay. Roberto says, nope, that's okay. For you, maybe it was The Honeymooners, or it was Dallas, or it was Seinfeld, whatever it was. All my Mandalorian fans will know what I'm talking about, though. On Fridays, when The Mandalorian comes out, which we're not in a season right now, one just ended, I don't even want to go online until I've watched the episode, because I'm afraid there's going to be a headline or a picture or something like that that will ruin it. And for all my Mandalorian friends, you remember that last episode and that surprise character that showed up. Can you imagine if before you watched that episode, you saw a headline or a photo or something that would have tipped you off to what was going to happen? I mean, that blew all of our minds, right? So friends, if we're not careful, if we stop innovating, there's constant spoiler alerts. Next week's worship, spoiler alert, is exactly like this week. We're just going to sing 3 different songs, and then we're going to have a prayer, and then we're going to have a sermon. It's going to be exactly the same, but different, different songs. Spoiler alert, the next week is the same thing, and the same thing, and the same thing. So friends, if it's been a while since you've tried something new, I want to encourage you to do that. Yeah, I'm seeing my WandaVision friends out there too. I just watched the final episode of that yesterday, which was fun. So I want to encourage you to continue to iterate and innovate. Now, in the early days of this, I just loved seeing what everybody was doing. And so I'm going to ask you in the chat, since I can't see you, if you want to laugh along, if you see anything here that's a little funny, you are welcome to express an LOL or a ha 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 or a groan or whatever. But I call this next set of slides Great Innovations in Online Worship. So this first one I call the cheap seats. You have to bring your magnifying glass to attend worship at this church if you really want to see what's going on. The next one took the opposite perspective. We call this too close for comfort. You might want to back that camera off just a little. And if you're not going to, you should at least trim your eyebrow hairs, just a touch maybe. I call this one surveillance camera worship. I like this one because it's got night vision and nothing gets stolen off the altar table anymore, which is great. I call this next one Defying Gravity. And this church, their tagline is come hang out with us. Every once in a while worship goes sideways. We don't really want sideways worship, but I love the comments here. You sound great, but turn your camera. My neck hurts. And we'll take the gospel to people any way we can, using any technology we can. I call this one Ring Doorbell Worship. You might as well go right out on your front porch and broadcast. And friends, I like to stay up with the times, so I call this next one Zoom Filtered Worship. I am not a cat. I am not a cat. I am not a cat. I hope those brought a little bit of fun to your world this morning or this afternoon. My major caution to you, friends, is as we go back into our buildings, we do not want to lose all the momentum we've gained in this last year. You have gained momentum. As hard as it's been, you have gained momentum. And so what I typically show in my full seminar is 3 different iterations of the Tonight Show and how the Tonight Show has changed over and over and over again. I'm going to show you one of the iterations in a second, but I want to show you very quickly a quote from my friend, kind of mutual friend in the speaking world, Carey Nieuwhof, and he has this to say. Carey says, too many church leaders will step right back into the past the moment they step back into their buildings. Friends, if you're a note taker, I want you to write this down. Don't step backwards, iterate forwards. The temptation is to go back to where we were at a year ago before the pandemic, not to iterate forwards. Take a look at where Jimmy Fallon found himself when he had to shut his building down.
Music. Thank you, my dog, Gary. And congrats on being promoted to a full-time emotional support animal. What are you doing?
I didn't look what Gary is.
What? Now you got to do this thing over here. Thank you. Franny, just press. You know what's the press, right? Yeah. Thank you. What? Thank you, wiping down doorknobs, for making me realize that before I cleaned you, Thank you for wiping down doorknobs, for making me realize that before this, I cleaned you a total of 0 times.
Now, part of the reason I wanted to show this to you was that his iteration from what he was doing in the room was very different when he went home. I hope that as you see that, you'll breathe easy. In fact, I want y'all just to take a big, deep breath in and let it out. Let's breathe easy, because that was on national television. And what I want you to hear, friends, is that slick is not nearly as important as authentic. Jimmy's daughters were in the shot. The graphics were printed out on paper. His daughter was running the iPad to share the music and so on. If Jimmy can do that on national TV, whatever you're doing in your worship is okay. Authentic is more important than being slick or perfect. So whether you're doing this with an iPhone or an Android or a computer or multiple cameras. What you do in front of the camera matters more than the camera itself. Now, while I do believe, and if I had more time, I'd show you what Jimmy did when he went back to the studio. The in-studio now does not feel like what it felt like pre-pandemic. The set is different. It's more casual. The band is spread out. He's wearing a casual clothing, sitting on a stool. It's just a very different experience. So what I encourage every church watching today to consider is how you might create what I call both and think tank. How can you reimagine the worship when you go back to in person, if you're not there yet, to look different than what it looked like before? And by its very nature, an iteration is based on what's come before, not a throw it all out, but how do we iterate and think about the next example? I love what Dr. Crawford talked about what stays and what goes. You know, when people have been sitting in their living room in their pajamas, fast forwarding to the parts they want to get to, how do we deal with that as we come back? So I would encourage you to start a both and think tank at your church. Now, I also think it's important that we properly prepare. While authenticity is more important than being slick, we do need to prepare. So I want to give you 3 things to consider doing in your worship. Number 1, talk through your plan together. I see a lot of online worship where people get up and it's like nobody knows who's supposed to go next or whatever. That just tells me that you did not talk through your worship order. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but you should have some sense of who's going to do what when. Second thing then is to walk through the transition. So how are you going to get from that opening song to that spoken word piece, and out of that spoken word piece into the scripture reading, and out of that scripture reading into the children's sermon, or whatever your worship is. And then finally, most importantly, the Holy Spirit is our most important team member. So pray it through, friends. And I can't tell you, so often it seems like we try to do this on our own power. If we do this on our own power, we're going to fail every time. So pray through your worship together. A point was made earlier, and I say this all the time in my training, and I just want to reiterate it if you didn't catch it the first time. You do not have a captive audience in your online experience. In the room, you do. People will sit through a lot of stuff that they would not sit through at home. And so I want you to consider that if we don't properly prepare, we can turn people off. I'm going to show you a clip. You tell me if you would make it all the way to the end of this worship service if you were tuned into it. Reading the comments during that. Most of you were ready to turn it off just a couple minutes in. Do you think they talked it through, walked it through, played it through, and prayed it through? Friends, I want to just remind you that our visitors judge us more harshly than our regulars. And another thing, I don't think I've said this yet, but we are now taking church to people on their turf. We're not having them come experience it on our turf. And so they're going to judge us more harshly. You've got a lot more people watching or participating in your worship than you ever have before. And so I want you to consider talking, walking, and praying through your worship. Let's talk about 3 strategies for what I call both and worship and how you might begin to prepare your worship for folks both in person and online. So the first one I call pre-both and worship. I define this as separate experiences. One is exclusively for online, and the other is exclusively for people in the room. And you don't actually stream your in-person worship. So basically, you pre-record a worship experience, and you put that on your Facebook page, your YouTube page, on your website, whatever. And then you do an in-person service that you don't make any compromises at all. You're just going to do it the way you always have. I wish I had time to get into all the nuances of this with you. We're going to really kind of do more of an overview today than to unpack everything I would tell you if I had the full 2.5 hours. Now, let me just say that whether you're a small church in the middle of nowhere, a rural church, or whether you're a church in the city, or whether you do highly liturgical worship or highly modern or non-traditional worship, whether you are very technically savvy, whether you don't know anything about technology, whether you're a large church or you're a small church, whether you have no money or you have a lot of money, any of these can work with you. Vaughn, at the end, I will put a form up, an evaluation, and if you fill that out, I can tell you more about how you can check out the full version of this particular talk. So I'll share that with you at the end. All right, so let's talk about this worship. Now, this is actually what my church does. I'm an attendee at this church. I'm not on staff. They do consult with me from time to time. But this is what they do. On Saturday morning, the pastor comes in, records the sermon. The band comes in and rehearses for a Saturday evening service. And then on Sunday morning, they have a 9:30 in-person service, or you can watch the pre-recorded online worship at 9:30, or you can go to the 11 o'clock in-person worship, and you can watch the online pre-recorded service at 11 o'clock as well. So there are some advantages to this one. The first of which is that if you're in a rural area, you don't have the ability to stream in real time. So you may pre-record your worship and upload it, and then people can come to your building on Sunday or watch online. There are lots of upsides and downsides. Again, I wish I could get into all of them, but we really can't today, just given our time. Let me just share a couple things with you. The first is that this is both and, in that you're reaching people in the room and at home, and you're not having to try and do both at the same time. If you're broadcasting in real time, which is the one I'm going to overview here for you in a moment, you have to remember you're talking to the people over here and in the balcony and at home. And right now, that camera, I heard somebody the other day say that about 70% of people are still worshiping at home. That camera represents more people than might be in the space. So you have to make sure that you're talking to all of them. If you pre-record worship, you're going to talk to the camera the entire time, because you're pre-recording, and you're going to talk to the room the entire time in person. You get a second take, which can be a good or bad thing, depending on who you are. You get to eliminate the issues that come with streaming in real time. Sometimes it's hard to make it happen fast enough. If you pre-upload and get it on the server, it plays better. Downsides, you do have to plan a little bit further ahead. You have a learning curve on software and equipment and so on. And so those can be challenges. Let's talk about some considerations for this type of worship. The first is that you have to consider service length. Now, if we believe Nona and what Nona told us, you can do it in person for an hour, but online, people don't have attention spans that are quite as long. Remember, there's something about that sacred space that you're in that makes up for a lot of what's happening in homes. You know, in my home, I've got a 12-year-old daughter, 15-year-old son, and a 4-year-old dog. And my wife and I and the kids will all sit in front of TV and participate in worship. The kids, I have the hardest time keeping them engaged. Certainly during the music, they don't really participate all that much. Dogs got to go out. You know, people are jumping up on Facebook chat, asking me, you know, where are you going to go to lunch today? And there's just a lot of distractions that you don't have in worship. Consolidating that is an important part of the online experience. Second thing is that singing is very different. Now, you just heard a whole workshop about singing, and I think in a Zoom setting, everything you just learned is so valuable. When you're streaming online, it's a very different experience than being in the room. And so what I've been hearing over and over is that not as many people are singing. So you might consider only including some of your songs in the online worship experience that you're pre-recording, and then do everything the same in your in-person experience. Now, one tweak on this might be that you would record all 6 songs that you're going to do in person and post them as a separate file online. So you can watch the whole worship experience that has 2 included. And you can even say in your live worship, hey, if you'd like to sing even more today, we've got a 6-song set posted on our Facebook page that you can check out when this is over. And what you basically allow people to do is opt in for that time rather than sit through it and be disengaged by it if they're not really singing. Now, let me just say, friends, I'm a musician. I play guitar. I've led worship in many different worship services. I've been a part of Chrysalis and Emmaus communities, for any of you that are familiar with that. I love music, but it's just a different experience being in your home than it is being in that worship space. Third thing to consider is your sermon length. If you're going to do a 25 or 35-minute service, you can't have a 20-minute or 30-minute sermon. That's called a sermon. That's not called worship service. And Dr. Crawford mentioned in her talk the idea that a lot of people are fast forwarding through things to get to the part that they want to watch. So two thoughts for you here. Number one, start to think in terms of the TED Talk version of your sermon for your pre-recorded online service. How many of you are familiar with TED Talks? Any TED Talk fans in the crowd today? TED stands for Technology, Education, and Design. All right, good. You're still with me. I'm glad to see you're still awake out there. Very good. TED Talks are awesome. Big fan, David. Awesome. Now, one of the things that's so great about TED Talks is that they are really shareable. The longest a TED Talk is allowed to be is 18 minutes. Many of them are 7 minutes or 10 minutes or 12 minutes, but the longest one is 18 minutes. And the reason it's 18 minutes is they found neuroscience has sort of, they've done some studies that have found that's about as much information as you can take in that amount of time with a number of different speakers and still be able to retain what you're learning. So if some of you have never heard of TED Talks, search TED Talks when this is over. You will not believe the incredible things that you can learn. My second favorite thing about TED Talks is they're really shareable. So it's much easier for me to say, Mary, who just popped up on my chat, Mary has a great sermon today. Let me share it with you. I guess I didn't say this. Take your sermon out of your worship service after you've posted the full thing and just post it as a separate file all by itself, because it's much easier for me to share Mary's sermon with my friends than to say, hey, Mary had a great sermon today. Here's my worship service. Skip to 20 minutes in, and then you'll find the service there, or you'll find the sermon there. People are not going to do that, but they'll share bits and pieces. The fourth thing I want you to consider is, what is the call to action? What do you want people to do as a result of the worship? I said to you a moment ago, we don't want watchers. We don't want viewers. We want worshipers. We want participants. So you got to tell people what you want them to do. What is the next step? Engage with them in the chat. Engage with them through the announcements, the action steps that you give. Remember, there are people on the other side of that camera. It's not just camera in the room, and we go about business as usual. Now, let me show you how even when you you can engage people in the chat. So I'm going to show you a friend of mine, Ben. He came to the Both And webinar back in January and sent me a clip to show what he's doing with this pre-recorded prayer time. Check it out.
This week, we have pre-recorded worship, which means that through the magic of the internet, I'm actually in 2 places at one time. I'm right here before you, but I'm also in the comments there on Facebook. And so while we won't share our prayer concerns live, I do want you to take this opportunity, even as I'm praying, to list your prayer concerns in the comments there, to lift things that you are grateful for this week, but also things that you want us to pray for. And as always, I go back and I read them. Today, I will be live commenting with you. And so please do feel free, even as I'm praying, that you can put your concerns. Think of typing your concerns as a way of praying along with us. So you don't have to just sit there with your eyes closed and your fingers off of a keyboard, but you can actually pray along by putting your prayer concerns in as I'm praying. And so I do invite you to take that opportunity to do that. Let us go to the Lord now in prayer.
So what you heard him say is, I'm in 2 places at once. We pre-recorded this today, but I'm hanging out with you in the chat. So friends, he's actually hanging in the chat when someone posts a prayer request. He'll put a comment on it. Now, I think we have to be a little bit careful about privacy concerns. Some folks are not going to want to put, God help me with my alcoholism, with all my church friends sitting there. So you may want to have a way for people to text it in. Another church that I'm coaching in Pennsylvania, they are doing this same idea, but they're having like a prayer service after worship that is on Zoom, that is live for like 10 minutes, and they'll deal with the prayer requests. But I want you to consider, if you haven't ever considered before, engaging people in the chat, both with prayer requests, but also you might have a reflection question for the day. So who is Jesus? Susan, I see that you say that Jesus is my everything. What a great response. Leave room to share those sorts of things in your worship. Now, let me ask another question. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I don't mean to talk like an auctioneer, but I want to get you through as much as I can here. Let me ask in the chat, how many of you have noticed that your live numbers have gone down a little, but your on-demand numbers, people watching on delay, have gone up? Have you noticed that your attendance has shifted some? In the early days of this, I think people really tuned in live as it was happening in the moment. And it seems to me that about 3/4 of the churches that I'm working with, only 2 of you are commenting. Is there anybody else live out there? All right. Only live, no recording. Okay, Marjorie, no worries. So what I'm hearing from the majority of churches that I'm talking to is that after they have posted their live worship that is being archived, and I would encourage you to consider recording and archiving it so that people can find you later. There's a great opportunity here, friends. If you post your worship that you've recorded, then you open it up to people who will find it later. So I'm seeing that some of you are not doing that, and I would encourage you to consider it. Here's what you have to consider. That some people are encountering your content months later, weeks later, years later. And so you might want to consider, how can we make this as evergreen as possible? So be careful about referring to 2 weeks ago. You remember I talked about this thing in the first part of this sermon series. Well, if I didn't watch 2 weeks ago, I'm not going to have any clue of what you're talking about. But I'll tell you that the trends are, everything I'm seeing in a year of doing this, people are now, for those who are recording, are starting to watch more on demand. Now, that is not a surprise when you consider that we are part of the Netflix, Disney Plus generation, and that's starting to happen with worship. Now, there's a whole section I have to skip. I'd love to talk about, can't do it, but I want to at least say one thing about it, and that is that I'm going to agree with Dr. Crawford said earlier. Relational matters more than anything right now. We need to build relationships with the people who are attending our online worship. So make that chat your digital narthex, your digital lobby, your digital welcome center. And if I had time to get into it, I would talk to you about the idea of having an online worship host. I think you should do that in the worship that you do. We don't have time to get into it. So one more thing I want to say here. People can only participate if we give them a way to do that. We've moved from monologue to dialogue in the worship that we're offering now. It used to be that one person would get up front and they'd talk. Now we have the opportunity to engage back and forth, to use the chat, to let people reflect and so on. Second type of worship I want to hit real quick here is what I call real-time both-and worship. I define that as worship that is done in such a way that you're giving attention to both audiences simultaneously. This happens live in the moment, and it may include a combination of live and pre-recorded elements. The best metaphor I can give you to think about what this looks like in your church is to think about professional sporting event. There's a big difference between going to the game and watching it at home. When you're at the game, you get to participate in the wave, you get to the energy of the crowd, the excitement of the space that you're in. It's just a different experience. When you're at home, you have multiple camera angles, you have commentators that make sense of what's happening, you have cleaner restrooms, you have cheaper snacks, all of those kind of things. There are advantages to both experiences. They're both watching the same thing, but the way that each audience is catered to is a very different strategy. And so I'm going to just name quick things here that we have to contend with. Number one is the difference in time. So one option might be that you would consolidate your time and just sort of split the difference. If you're doing an hour in person and you listen to Nona who says go 40 minutes, you might go 50 minutes. The downside of that is that everybody has to compromise. So people that want to come in person feel cheated that you cheated them out of 10 minutes. And the people online, you're keeping them 10 minutes longer than they might want to stay. So I don't think this is the best option, but it's an option. And I know some churches that are doing it. The other option that I have found that has been very helpful is to do a staggered approach to your in-person and online service. So you might start worship at 10 o'clock in the morning, leave out some of the songs because people aren't singing anyway. So maybe after you get to the fourth song, you then welcome your online congregation. Hey, welcome to worship today. We're so glad you're here. And then you sing song 5 and 6 for the room, but it's actually song 1 and 2 for the online audience. And then maybe after the sermon, rather than singing the songs of response, you send them on their way at that point. Hey, thanks for coming to worship today. We hope you'll join us again, either in person next week at 10 a.m. or online at 10 a.m. And then you've effectively cut out 10 minutes of worship at the beginning and 10 or so minutes at the end. And now you have an hour in-person service and a 40-minute in the midst of that. And I wish I had more time to unpack that with you. But I think it's a valuable thing for us to consider in this time. Also, consider that not everything in the room translates to at home. Things like communion. I was at a church last fall that did a collection of those Operation Christmas Child boxes, and this is a snapshot I took it. They had 101 boxes come forward. Now, in the room, that's inspiring stuff. People are bringing those boxes up. It's great. But at home, here's what you'd see. They have one camera in the back of the room, and most of that time would be people walking in front of the camera, and you'd be seeing backsides and behinds and all that kind of stuff for 3 minutes at home. That's an opportunity for me to kind of take off and go refill my coffee and maybe forget to come back or let my dog out or whatever. You might create what I call alternate moments. The idea of an alternate moment is that you're going to create a scenario where people at home might see something different in the room. So you might say, is our collection of the blessing of the backpacks, and those backpacks are coming forward. I'm sorry. I have two different examples that I got mixed up. Today is the collection of the Operation Christmas Child boxes. We have 101 that are going to come forward today. And if you're watching from home, this is what a blessing or the Operation Christmas Child is all about. 3, 2, 1. Now, I'm not going to show the whole video, but you would have 3 minutes to watch the video while all of the boxes are coming up. In the room, they're not seeing that. The boxes coming up is way more inspiring, but you're creating something for me at home. In the same way that when you watch football, if someone gets injured, they're not just going to show the player being tended to for 10 minutes on camera. They're going to show scores from another game, or the commentators are going to talk to you, or they're going to show a pre-produced highlight reel or whatever. They're going to keep you engaged. All right, 2 more things I'm going to hit quickly here. I want you to consider that we have multiple congregations we are reaching at this time. You have the people that are in person with you in the room. You've got people at home that are connected to your faith community. You know those folks. You've got people who are watching online for the very first time, or maybe have walked in your door for the first time. And then most of us are discovering that we've got people who are watching at a later time. So when you create worship, keep in mind all 4 of those audiences. There are things that you can do that are interactive in the room. You could send things out ahead of time. I know a lot of churches did an Advent candle send ahead kit where those candles came in the mail or dropped off on our doorstep, and we could still participate at home even as people are participating in the room. And then I even like the idea of maybe having a downloadable digital file that would allow you to participate if you're a first-time visitor or if you're watching on delay. The last type of worship that I'm going to just hit quickly here for you is what I call post both and worship. This is worship that is recorded live with audience in mind, but offered only to the in-person audience right then and there in real time. This worship is captured and edited and repurposed for an online audience on delay. So this basically on Sunday morning, you're just going to do worship the way you always do worship. You're going to have cameras that capture it, but you're not actually going to stream it at that time. If you're in a rural church, this might be the option for you. You don't have to compromise so much. You do need to look at the camera sometimes. But then when that worship is over, you're going to take the sermon and a couple songs and edit it all together and post it online. You could do it a week offset, so your online worship is always a week after, or you can even do it same day. I'll tell you about my favorite church that's doing this. The name of the church will tell you everything you need to know about them. They're called Farmersville United Methodist Church. They're not a big church. They're in the middle of nowhere. They're in Farmersville, which tells you something. They don't even have fast internet at their church. At 9 a.m., they start their worship. They record it. Their worship ends about 9:45. At 9:45, they take that recording, take the sermon out, a couple songs out, put it with some announcements that they already had put into an editing program, spit all that out, upload it to Facebook, and by 11 a.m., their online worship begins. So you can either come to in person at 9 a.m. or you can watch the post-edited both and worship after the fact. So what I want you to hear, friends, is that all three of these options make it so that nobody feels like they're secondary, not the people watching from home or worshiping from home, and not the people who are in the room. Final thing I'm going to share with you is what I call the both and audit. This is a tool that I created to help churches think about both audiences and make sure that they don't forget one or the other. So let me back up here. First, I think you should assign advocates to both experiences. Somebody's got to care most about that online community. Somebody's got to care most about the in-person community. And then you have to have some healthy conversation about how are we going to make this work for both? 7 questions to ask. What is the purpose of this aspect of worship, and does it translate to both audiences? And again, I don't care if you're doing highly liturgical, highly non-traditional worship, camp style worship. It doesn't matter what kind of worship you do. You have to ask that question. Second thing is, does this moment belong in both experiences? Not everything will belong in both experiences. Is there a participatory or interactive way of doing this? Remember, we don't want watchers. We want worshipers. We don't want viewers. We want participants. And so we have to consider that. Fourth thing to consider is this too short or too long for either audience? How does this moment that we're talking about, that we're designing for worship today, translate on screen at home? And do we need an alternate moment? Does this need any additional contextualization for either audience? Remember that in the room, you have peripheral vision. You can see everything and the screen. At home, you only have the screen. And then finally, how will a first-time viewer or visitor in person receive this? And the final thought I'm going to give to Carrie Newhoff, who says that right now, pastors are using online to bring people into the building. And he believes in the future, pastors will use the building to get people online. And I believe that's true because we have this great opportunity now to dialogue with folks and not just broadcast our program to them, but truly invite them into something that they are participants in. So that concludes the presentation part of my time. We will get into some questions. I'm going to put in the chat for you a way for you to connect with me. I've got an evaluation for my session today, but also if you put your information in that survey, there's a question at the end that says, is there anything else that you'd like to ask that we didn't ask you? You can put, if you're interested in obtaining the full 2.5-hour presentation, just put your info there and I can get with you on how to make that happen. And I appreciate the opportunity and the time I've had to share with you today. Suzanne, what do we got question-wise?
I was just doing following that link, and I really needed to not do that, right?
That's okay. That's okay.
Thank you so much for the tools that you've given us and the considerations that you've given us to think about. I appreciate the time that you took to try and consider what would be important for us today, being that your webinars are much longer. So I'm very impressed that you were able to do it. I actually really appreciate the ways that you connected us with the other speakers today, Dr. Wiseman, Dr. Crawford, and Dr. Tell, and you have given us an incredible gift. All of you have given us an incredible gift today, I think, and I'm very, very thankful. But I do have some questions for you. Some folks are pushing back against what you said. So
That's
be ready.
okay.
We are a seminary community, so we do that.
That's okay. I can take it.
And we've got so many that I'm not sure we're going to get through them all. But again, it sounds like you are open to answering questions for people. So we'll see how many we can get through. The first one is, we don't record because of copyrights. We're too small to pay for licensing. It was a comment that was made. And I just wanted to point that out to you. Thoughts about that?
Well, if you are too small to pay for those licenses, that's probably the best move. Or if you pre-record your worship, you just don't include the music portion of your worship in your recording. So you can edit the portion of worship and put a graphic on the screen that says the music portion of worship is omitted due to copyright concerns. Then you can have the best of both worlds. There is a whole section in that handbook I posted on copyright and licensing and where you can go to get that info. So there's more than I could tell you is in that handbook on multiple pages about licensing.
Great. How do you include words on the Zoom screen as shown in the example presentation that you gave?
I am using a program called Ecamm Live. I'm a Mac user, so it's only on the Mac, but there are other programs that will let you do that on non-Mac computers, on PCs. There's a program called vMix that you can use that will do it. There's a free program, our absolute favorite word in the church, right? A free program called OBS, Open Broadcast Software, and you'll find a link to that in the handbook that I posted at the beginning of our time together, so you can check that out. And that will let you lay over graphics, that will let you show videos like I showed you, that will let you hook up more than one camera to your computer, and that then streams out to whatever service you're using.
So when I hear hybrid worship, I think of digital worship happening at the same time as in-person worship. Does it make sense to have an in-person worship and an online worship at different times?
I think that everything makes sense. So that's another option. That's what I mean by pre-recording. You may have an in-person worship at one time and you may have an online worship. Those can happen at the same time, or they can happen asynchronously. I mean, I think that's part of the excitement of the world we're living in right now. And I understand there's some theological questions to ask. There's some, I think we have to remember that this is not as mature as what we've spent centuries working on. So we have a lot of questions to still answer. I know some churches right now that are only doing digital church. They've decided that's the way of the future and that's where they're going to go. I know other churches that are trying to use their online to bridge the community in person to online. I know churches that have said, we're not going to do online. What I want you to consider is this both and thing is important moving forward because we have expanded our reach in ways that I don't think we have even begun to process. I've heard churches for so many years say, we want to reach more young people. Well, where do young people hang out? They hang out online. Do young people walk into church buildings who are not connected to the church? Maybe not, but could they find us on a Facebook feed and be interested in what we're saying and find us in that way? I believe that is, I'm seeing it happen, quite honestly, in many of the churches that I'm connected to. So.
And I think this kind of answers one of the other questions too, which is someone is playing with the idea of they were online, they went back to in person, they're going back online, now they might go back into person again, and how can they keep that close interaction? And they're thinking that maybe the pastor could even do like time with the pastor or something after to have on a Zoom meeting with folks just to get together.
Yeah, I'm a fan of having a post-worship Zoom conversation. So you could put in the chat or even announce at the end of your worship, hey, we're going to have an opportunity to dialogue today about what we talked about. So if you'd like to come hang out after worship, we're going to have a Zoom party and you're welcome to come be a part of that with us. And so I'm seeing churches do that. And that has been a really cool strategy. There's one other thing I was going to say to you. And that is that those of us who are considering dropping online worship when the pandemic is over, if we go there, consider that like you have learned to play a new instrument. I've used this once or twice, but imagine you're a guitar player and one day all your strings break at the beginning of the pandemic and you go to order new strings and you find out that there's only one supplier and they're so backed up because of a pandemic, you can't get strings for 10 months. Well, you're also a musician. So you start to sit down at the piano, you start noodling, you start playing, you're like, wow, I'm starting to get pretty good at this. It sure would be a shame if the day your guitar strings came in, you strung your guitar up and never sat down at the piano again because you learned to play it. And there are some people that like piano music a whole lot better than guitar music. So you have learned to play a new instrument, friends. You have learned to take the gospel to people in new and effective ways. I think it would be a mistake for us to retreat from that.
Great. So here's an interesting pushback sort of. So we had a couple of folks coming from a very highly liturgical tradition. And I shared a little bit in the answer there that the UMC also has the full gamut, which you are most familiar with, although you have worked with other churches and other traditions. But, the UMC has the full gamut of highly liturgical to more free flowing. So what about a liturgical tradition like the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America? How can they innovate? They're kind of constrained. Episcopal churches I'm thinking of are constrained to texts.
Interestingly enough, in this pandemic, this particular training was developed with an organization called the Center for Congregations. They actually reached out to me because they hosted the other training that you came to about a year ago and said, what's next? And I said, well, I really think we got to think about both and. When I do events for them, I'm not allowed to use the word church. It's congregation. So I have everyone from Episcopal priests to rabbis to Catholic priests and everything in between. And I've actually had two rabbis reach out to me to talk about how this works in their tradition. And I've done a little consulting and coaching there. But I also just took on a 6-month relationship with an Episcopal priest out of Louisiana. And so we're thinking about all of that right now. And how do you translate? Part of it doesn't mean, I think that we just have to think about the whole idea of the new wine and the old wineskins. We've got to find a wineskin that works for today, which is not to say that we're dumbing down the gospel or we heard Dr. Wiseman say that. This is really about using language and practices that makes sense for the time in which we live, So I'm a big fan of, I had to skip part of my presentation, which really I wanted to get to because she talked about the idea of the hook. Dr. Wiseman talked about the hook, and I have a whole section where I talk about the hook. I really look at what Jesus did with metaphor. Mark 4:33. Check out Mark 4:33 and look at it closely. This is Mark's gospel of Jesus starts with the parable of the seed and the sower, and the disciples don't understand what he's talking about. And they're like, we don't get it. What do you mean? And he says, well, don't you understand this parable? How are you going to understand any parable? And he explains it. And then he doesn't retreat to the temple and just go back to the way that they did things before. He does the parable of the lamp on a stand, the parable of the growing seed, the parable of the mustard seed. And Mark 4:33 says, with many similar parables, Jesus spoke the word to them as much as they could understand. He did not say anything without using a parable, but when he was alone with his disciples, he explained everything. And so those parables kind of had two different functions. One was that it illuminated the gospel and brought these truths to people, and they would walk away. And anybody that saw mustard seed from that day forward probably remembered the lesson that he taught with it. But he was using language that wasn't of the temple. It was the language of the marketplace, of the people. And of course, some of those parables were really about raising sacred questions, not about answering all of them. And some people didn't get it. But the second part of that was he said when he was alone with his disciples, he explained everything. So, there was this relationship between what happened in the big setting and in the worship setting or whatever, and in small group. And so I think that a lot of that applies to where we're at today is that we have to remember that, again, we're taking worship to people now. We can't assume all the same things when they were coming to our building. There's a certain amount of expectation that you have that if somebody's coming to church, they have some idea what church is, some idea of what the tradition is. Well, now we're taking church to them on Facebook, on YouTube, on their turf. So we have to build bridges into those rituals and customs and practices that we know so well. That's probably way too long of an answer, but.
No, that's and this kind of ties into it then, because someone was asking about with the liturgical tradition, many times everything is considered worship. And so it sounded like you were trying to rip apart the tradition. Not sure that was your intent, but would like to hear more about that. And then also just, some of the liturgy, yes, it is predictable. But we don't want to take out, the baby with the bathwater. I mean, I will not give up the Our Father. I'm sorry. So
that's okay. So first and foremost, I grew up in a traditional liturgical church. So that has meaning for me. The downside of an hour conversation over the 2.5-hour conversation is that I get to get into the nuance of many of these things and break them down a little bit more. A couple things. One is that what I am suggesting is that we're reinvigorating the tradition and we're communicating it in a new way. So we're telling our old story in a new time, in a new way, with new technology, in some ways for a brand new audience. And so with music, I see every aspect of worship being worship. So music is worship, scripture is worship, prayer is worship, sermon is worship, our response is worship. Even the announcements, if you do them right, can be worship. So I think there's value in all of those things. But I also think that we have to be careful. We can't, I skipped this part, but in the early days of film, when film cameras were first invented, they took film cameras into theaters and they put them in the fifth row back center seat, and they would just record stage plays. Because all they ever knew prior to that was actors getting up on a stage. And so we've got this new device. It's called a camera. We can record stage plays. Well, one day somebody said, what if we reimagine the stage play experience? And someone took the camera up on the stage and they got a close up. And they started moving the camera around. Then they put the camera on wheels. And of course, now we have cameras on drones. And we keep telling the story in a different way. So you could go to the theater and watch Hamilton, and it would be a really interesting experience to get to do that. Or you can watch it on Disney Plus, where they have close-ups and moving cameras, and they've adapted the story just a little bit. Some of us get really uncomfortable with the idea of an adaptation because I think, oh boy, I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but sometimes I think we confuse Jesus and the horse he rode in on in our lives. What I mean is that we confuse Jesus in the context in which we met Jesus, and sometimes that becomes the most sacred of practices. But as I see it, Jesus told us that we have to continually find new wineskins. So what is the new wineskin? We're not throwing the wine out. We're just finding a new way to deliver that to folks. So I may have just gotten myself in a whole lot of trouble by that, but you're muted there.
We'll leave it at that. We'll let you stay in trouble. Hopefully you're getting into some good trouble. And Jason, that was amazing. Again, everything was amazing. And I just want to mention again the thank you to the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship, who underwrote all of this through our grant, to Dr. Weimer, Dr. Taylor, Dr. Tanner, who worked so hard to make this all possible, and the ways that they supported me as I began to dream of offering this webinar. And remember, you too can apply for grants and take advantage of previous grant participants on their website who have many, many resources for you. And would you now please accept this blessing? Go forth into the world in peace. Be of good courage. Hold fast to that which is good. Render to no one evil for evil. Strengthen the faint-hearted. Support the weak. Help the afflicted. Honor everyone. Love and serve God. Rejoicing in the power of the Holy Spirit and the blessing of the triune God. God be among you and remain with you always. Amen.
Amen.
God bless everyone. Thank you, thank you, thank you.